Hey YouTube, so we're underneath the truck and the transmission is on the jack, and all I did so far was push the transmission over to where it's going to be going, near the engine here. But before you do, on this year Chevy and on this type of transmission, this is 700 R4, there's a cable here that comes down from the throttle body linkage, and what you want to watch for is there's a cable here, okay, with a real small hole in it, and there's a pin in here, a linkage rod, very small linkage rod. I don't know if you can see it there on the top of my finger. That has to go into this, that goes into this cable, or the cable goes over that. So and it's not exactly the easiest thing to find, but it's not hard to put on, it just slips on. So you need to put that together. Let me get it together here and then I'll pick it up. Okay, so that's on there. You can see the linkage rod here goes onto this cable. And then what you want to do is, there's a grommet down in there for the rubber to seal this piece that goes in. So you want to just push that down in there and make sure that that linkage has stayed in there. Now you can't see the linkage once you push it down in, so you don't know if it stayed on there or not. But here's the thing, there's a, if you, let me just pull this back out, if you look there, well, it came off, but if you look, you can see that this part of this cable comes down over top of this linkage like so, and it'll actually keep it on there for you. So when you push it, and then you push it down in, it's a little bit tricky, but you know, once you do it a couple times, it's not a big deal. And then there's a bolt that goes in here yet, so we have to get that bolt. Okay, so this little bolt here I'm putting in, man, is it hard to hold all this stuff. Alright, so there's a bolt here that goes into this cable that comes down from the throttle body. Now once that linkage is hooked together, you put this in here and it compresses the rubber sleeve that's inside the metal. So in other words, where that linkage was, the hole, the big round hole that the linkage was coming out of, you have to put a seal in there first that this piece of plastic fits into, and that seals against the sides of the transmission. So once you put that in there, then you can put it together and set it down in. And then you got to tight snug up on this bolt here. Now because this is plastic, I would say not to go too crazy tightening it up. So I use a little wrench for this. And once it's tight, that'll be good for that. Okay, so I'm up on top of the motor, and this bottom linkage cable that's here, that gets attached to the throttle body, if you want to make sure that this is in the transmission, just pull on it, and if it pulls back, then you know that it's hooked in there right. Now you can hook it in underneath, and you can say to yourself, okay, it's hooked in, I'm just going to put that together and leave it at that. But it's actually the kick down for the transmission. When you push it so far, it'll kick it down into the lower gear. But coming up here, there's no springs on this cable that's here. This cable that I'm trying to show you here, this cable, other than the one that's in the transmission. So when you pull on it, if it goes back, then you know that it's hooked in the transmission, and then you're safe with that. Now the other thing that you want to watch out for is there's two brass connectors there, right here. Okay, those two brass connectors. The transmission coolant lines, which are right here, go from these out through a radiator, a small radiator in the front of the truck, and they come back and attach there to cool the transmission fluid. Now, one of the things that I was a little surprised at, because they didn't tell me it until after I bought it, is that they recommend not flushing the line. They recommend that you replace the transmission cooler. So you're looking at around $45 for that. So I'll probably end up doing that. Now, once I put all this together, it's going to be really hard to get at these transmission lines here, because right now this frame for the transmission has to be moved all the way up to where my arm is. Okay, so once you move this up here, you have very small amount of space to get up there to put them together. It's not that bad though, it should be able to be done, so I guess I'll just let them go, and I'll put them together after I get the transmission mounted in. Now the other thing here about a Chevy, I've never seen any that don't have it, but there's always a first time, is when you line the transmission up, if you look here, there's a dowel pin right in front of that screwdriver. Can you see that there? It's a dowel pin. Let me get a flashlight. So that dowel pin, there's one on each side. Right there you can see it sticking up. That dowel pin, there's one there, and there's one on the other side right there. Okay? That shiny thing we're looking at up there. So there's two places on the transmission where they fit in. One is right here where the flashlight is, there's a hole in there, and then the other one is on the other side. So what I've done with the transmission so far is I've taken it and I pretty much have the transmission lined up with the motor the right way, as far as, you know, the angle that I'm needing for the bell housing to meet the back of the motor. But what I need to do is jack this up a little bit, and you can see there's like a red dye inside of one of the containers there. What we're going to do is we're going to bring this transmission in. Now I'm bringing it in on the jack, but it has to go up higher yet. I really like this jack, it's easy to get at. Push it forward. Now you can see that that pin is ready to, it's actually taken the transmission there. So the transmission is entering that dowel pin, and looks like the other side has to be pushed in as well. So what I'm going to do is get behind the transmission over here, over this end, and push towards the motor with my foot against the back of the transmission, just to get it to go against the bell housing good. Now it does look like, you can tell that the angle here between this torque converter and the flywheel, you can see the angle's not quite right there. So what we can do is we can take this jack here, and we can turn this knob to get that to change a little bit, because you want that to be as close to being even. There it goes, right like that. So now you can see that the transmission is in the pins, actually on both sides, but it's a little bit low, so we can tighten the back of the jack handle, go up a little bit, and that should be good. Okay, now what we want to do before we tighten the torque converter to the flywheel, we want to put 2 bolts from the transmission into the bell housing of the engine, or into the engine. The bell housing is actually on the transmission, so we want to put bolts somewhere near here in the back to come through into the block of the engine on both sides, at least 1 bolt, just to keep it from moving back, because if the transmission should slide back after you start tightening the torque converter to the flywheel, you're going to have to play games trying to get the shaft back onto the torque converter. So you really don't want to have to play that game, because it's kind of tough on some cars. I know on some Dodges it's like turning tumblers trying to get them back in on a safe, but Chevys aren't that bad for that. So we're going to put 2 bolts in there. Okay, YouTube, so if you look right there, you can see that the bell housing is against the engine block tight there, and the other side's the same way. I have those bolts in around there. Now, we put the speedometer or the accelerator cable in, and the kickdown cable, or I should say the kickdown cable. And now what you want to do here is, this is the filler tube that I have my hand on for the transmission. Now inside there, where the filler tube goes, and because it's got so many bends in it up there, it's not really easy to get to where you need it, but there's a cap plug in there which is junk, and what you want to do is you want to put a new sealer in here. Okay, so I know you can't really see it, but I put the seal in there. I'm going to moisten my fingers, believe it or not, with some spit, and I'm going to put that filler tube, I'm going to enter it into that grommet. So I can't really get a good grip on it here to pull it down in, so what I'm going to do is go up above and pull it in from up above. Now the thing is if you look there, I don't know if you can see it way up in there, but there's a bracket coming off of the filler tube. That bracket eventually goes into the bolt hole. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah, there's a, I think that's a good thing of it there. There's a bracket there coming from the right to the left, black paint, and then you can see the hole to the bell housing, bolt hole in the top of that bell housing. I believe, yeah, it would be this one right here, and right there's the bracket. So that bracket then, right, this bracket has to come down to that, and the way it'll do it is when I push the tube into that grommet. So I'm going to go up above and do it from above. So here's the filler tube. Here's the filler tube for the transmission. All I did was push it down and it's already inside there. It didn't take much. But what I will tell you is, right now the engine is hanging back because the transmission mount is not under the transmission. The transmission has to go up, you know, to be able to sit on the mount. You're better off putting that filler tube now before you lift the engine back up, because of all the bends that are in it, it's really hard to get it to where it needs to be. Now that it's down in there, I'm going to put a bolt through the bracket from it into the bell housing, and I'll show you that. Alright, so if you look up there, you can see, where the heck is it in the camera? Oh, right here, you can see the bracket with the bolt there going through the bell housing into the engine. So that's the bracket that holds the filler tube on. It's a real pain in the butt to get that on there if you don't have the transmission lowered like it is. It doesn't really go in there that easy. You would think that it would, but it doesn't. So that's something you want to put on like before you put the transmission all the way up. Okay, so we've got that tube in there and all the bolts then that go around the bell housing. And I started the threading of the cooler lines into the fittings just to make it a little bit easier, because once I lift the transmission up, it's kind of hard to get at that. I'm going to cut them off down here and then join new lines to it, to a new cooler. But this way here I won't have to be fooling around trying to get at that, because with the catalytic converter and stuff here, I can barely get my arm up through here. I can reach this now, but when they're up higher, they're going to be closer to the metal of the cab and I won't be able to do anything with them really well. I might even tighten them before I raise it up. But the next thing we're going to do is, because this truck is four-wheel drive, there's an adapter on here. Normally you would have the tailpiece of the transmission, it would already be bolted on the transmission. But what we have here is this. This is a machine piece. You want to be careful with this, you don't nick it. Both sides. There's a rubber gasket here, you can see, that rolls down onto this piece that's protruding out of here, but it's machined. So that fits inside here so that we can adapt the transfer case to this transmission. So there's 4 bolts in that, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. and the gasket there will sit inside of this. So I'm going to just put a little bit of transmission fluid on my finger and rub it around this gasket, because there'll be transmission fluid in here later when you fill the transfer case. So I'm going to just put some lubricant around there, transmission fluid, just to lube that a little so it doesn't give me any grief later. And also, just so you know, this transmission mount here is not bolted in. It actually goes where the two bolts are up here further. It's been pushed away so the transmission could come down, otherwise it wouldn't be able to come down. Now, the two mounting brackets that are on the transmission, these won't be used, because there's a mounting bracket on this the adapter for the tailpiece to go to four-wheel drive, or to the transfer case. So that's going to be what rests on the transmission cross member here. So we'll bolt that in. Okay, we got the tailpiece bolted onto the transmission there. Now, I have it resting on the cross member. I pushed it up there. Remember, it's not bolted in place. The bolts are out of it. So I just pushed it up a little bit to take the weight of the transmission, because this jack, without anything on it, will not pick the transmission up high enough to be able to get the mounting block. And I'll show you that. The mounting block here for the transmission. So this actually bolts onto the bottom of the transfer, or the adapter for the transfer case, and then rests in, and you put the nuts on from the bottom here. Now, the one thing, because I have these apart here, you don't want to go tightening all this stuff up. You can tighten the bolts that go from this mounting bracket if you have to the transmission, but or to the adapter. I really wouldn't do that. To the adapter, I just put everything together sort of loosely. But what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to I have some blocks that were cut on the wood miser. I have some blocks here that I'm going to use to pick the transmission up high enough to be able to get the adapter under there. And you can see everything's moving up there, the transmission and all. So we want to get that high enough. Yeah, to be able to put this block underneath here. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to bolt this onto here, and then we'll put it through into the transmission, or to the cross member. So that's what we're going to do next. Okay, YouTube, so when you're putting the transmission frame that holds the transmission back into place, you want to leave everything loose. I actually built this frame that's under this truck all the way to the back of the truck, and I made this transmission mount. You can see by the weld there that it's not factory, because it's not pressed. I welded this all together. But the thing is when you go to put one of these together, you want to make sure that all the bolts are loose. You can see the bolts are loose here. The nuts that go up inside these holes onto the bolts that stick down through here are not on yet. Okay, they'll be easy to get on, but I'm just saying, you want everything to be loose, because if it's all loose like this, the two that are over there on that side, if they're all loose, then you can get it all together without any trouble. Otherwise, you may have to try and be yuxing it back and forth, or front or back, trying to get it together. So when I was putting it together, I put these bolts into this frame first, and when I did that, even though this mount looks symmetrical, I actually had to flip it end for end to put it back to make it fit into the holes exactly. So we should be in good shape so far now. So the transmission jack is out, you can see, and the frame is all bolted in place now, tightened up. Yeah, tightened up, and I need to get this cover on here for the bottom of the bell housing. What I wanted to show you was I cut the exhaust pipe to be able to get this on here. Or get the cover off. That's how tight it is. So even though the bolts are right here for this thing, these are a nightmare because I don't want to break them. If I break them, then I got to be playing games trying to fix that. I'd rather not fool with it right now. This is easy for me to weld, or I can even put a piece on here. Not worried about that, but it gives me a little bit of movement here to be able to get that cover up there. So that cover is going to be next. I had said I was going to put this cover on here, but I needed to bolt the catalytic converter to the flywheel. I hadn't done that yet, so I'm working on that now. There's only 3 bolts on here, and technically when you take this, if you took the transmission out and you used the same catalytic converter, or I mean torque converter, you should have actually marked this to put it in the same spot that it's supposed to be in. I have no way of knowing what, you know, how this is balanced or anything. I don't see anything on here to tell me where to put it, so I'm just bolting it in as such. There's only 3 bolts on it, and you have to turn the motor to be able to tighten these things, and they need to be fairly tight. There's a slot. Let me grab a screwdriver. There's a slot inside here where the bottom of the bolt goes. You can sort of hold the torque converter from turning and tighten the bolts as you go, and you want to make sure that they're good and snug. Okay, YouTube, so you can see that the transmission is basically in, but the transfer case is not on. The adapter to the transfer case is on, and everything's bolted down, the cross member's bolted down. The throttle cable that comes down for the kick down is in, the filler tube is in, and the tubes that go to the cooler, the oil cooler, are in. Now I'm going to be cutting these oil cooler lines and flaring them and connect to another set, but I didn't want to have to try and get my hand up there to tighten these. Even though I can touch these lines with my fingers, I ended up cutting a wrench. I don't know if I have it laying here, but I ended up cutting a line wrench in half. Yeah, here it is, to be able to get the wrench to turn on that thing. That's how bad it was to get at. So anyway, I'm going to cut those cooler lines somewhere in here, and then I'll put probably rubber hoses. Maybe I'll even put rubber hoses over. The starter's in place. The bottom of the bell housing is in. I don't know what these are supposed to be. These bars coming from the engine, I don't even know what they call them. Probably some kind of a I don't know, torsion rods or something. Not to be confused with these, but it must be for some reason. Never had them on any other Chevy. I don't know why they have them on these. But anyway, there they are. I replaced some of this black tubing on some of the wires that were down here just to make sure that they give me a little longer life yet. Let me just tell you, I know you're going to need Dramamine to be able to watch the first part of this video, and I'm sorry about that. It's the first time I've actually did auto repair, or actually probably the second time. I think I did a Jeep motor, put a camshaft in a Jeep. But anyway, what I got to do is put an adapter on here for the oil filter, because this oil filter comes out of here on an angle rather than straight down because of the drive shaft when the drive shaft goes in. So on this side here, there's a linkage. I'm not sure if that linkage is right yet. I got to look at it again, but there's a linkage here. There's some sensors, and then there's one that goes back to the transfer case that I don't have on yet. So I'm going to have to weld this together or put some kind of a sleeve over this. And like I had said in the video before, if you didn't get dizzy watching it, I had to pull this down so that I could get the torque converter cover on. And also I had mentioned in the one video I called the torque converter a catalytic converter. So I mean, I know better. It's just I get tongue-tied sometimes. So anyway, I did bolt the torque converter to the flywheel before I put the cover on. So I was reading in a little article, it said here that this transmission, I find this amazing. This transmission has a thermometer on it here. As long as this is white, this button, it says in the paper that came with the transmission that the temperature of the transmission has been cool. But if you don't keep the transmission cool, which means you have to have the radiator out there with just for the transmission, I guess this thing turns red or something, or black or whatever, and then they won't warranty the transmission. It's going to be interesting to see what that's like. I ought to put a temperature gauge on it just to see what temperature it does get up to. Now I can't really read that, you know, with my eyes here, but maybe I can see that, what temperature it actually changes at. So I have to put the transfer case in yet, both drive shafts, and then the linkage, fill the transmission with oil, put the new coolant on, or not coolant, the little cooler for the transmission fluid, and I'm going to put one up in the front of the engine, and then I should be good. I've seen those coolers on certain cars underneath the car too already, but I don't know how good that would be. I'm going to buy a fairly big one so it keeps it nice and cool when I'm plowing. Alright guys, so sorry this isn't the greatest video. It's a lot harder to make a video with working on a car than it is when you're doing the wood miser, I can tell you that. So anyway, there we are. Yeah, I had said before that I had made this frame, and I know a couple guys watched my videos just for the frame, and this frame was holding up very well here. I made all these cross members, both cross members that hold the gas tank, the spring perches, I made those. I made the shock absorber mounts at the top, both sides, and even these cross members. I made this and mounted these all together. The only thing I bought those because they were readily available. None of the other stuff was available. I used aircraft nuts to tighten everything together with grade 8 bolts, and so far this thing's been holding up pretty nice, and I feel as long as the truck outlasts me, I'll be happy. So that's why I put the new frame underneath here, because the truck was running good. I always liked this truck, and it wouldn't pass inspection because the frame had gotten rusty. So I just took it all apart and rebuilt the entire thing. Alright guys, I'm going over for today. Tomorrow's another day. Bye.